Jane Green is the author of 18 New York Times bestsellers and 19 USA Today bestsellers. She has over 10 million books in print, is published in over 25 languages, and has several books in development for film and TV. She is a former journalist in the UK and a graduate of the International Culinary Center in New York. Her newest book, Sister Stardust, will be published April 5th, 2022 by Hanover Square Press, and is Jane's first work of biographical fiction, a story that breathes new life into a complicated fashion icon and the tumultuous world she inhabited. Page-turning, lush, and luminously drawn, Sister Stardust is a Parade Most Anticipated Book of the Year, an Indie Next pick, and a Library Reads pick. Brenda Janowitz is the author of 7 novels, including The Grace Kelly Dress and most recently, The Liz Taylor Ring. She is the former books correspondent for Pop Sugar, and her work has also appeared in the New York Times, Real Simple, The Washington Post, and the New York Post, among others. She's a graduate of Cornell University and Hofstra School of Law. She lives in New York with her husband and 2 sons. So without further ado, please help me in giving a warm welcome to our featured guests. Jane and Brenda, take it away, ladies.
Oh, thank you so much, Dana. Hi, everybody. Hi, Bren.
Hi, honey. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. First, I have to say we should thank RJ Julia. Thank you so much for having us.
Oh,
we were here last month for the launch of my book, and we had so much fun that we obviously had to do it again.
yeah, it really was. And there's something very wonderful about doing an event with somebody that you know and somebody that you love and a friend. And there's a chemistry that happens that, you know, it's kind of unique. So as soon as we finished, we were like, we're gonna do it again next time. Yeah.
I know. And I should tell, for those of you who don't know me, you know, before I knew Jane, I was a fan of Jane, and I've been reading Jane's books since Jemima J, since I first fell in love with Jemima, and I've been a fan ever since. I've loved Jane's chick lit, and then I loved it when she moved into women's fiction and got into heavier, deeper topics. And now we're here and we're about to be talking about Sister Stardust, which is actually Jane's first foray into historical fiction. So Jane can do it all. And I'm just going to give you a sneak peek, including drawing and painting. I mean, she literally can do it all, but I think we should start talking about the writing part of doing it all. Okay. And I think we should give everyone a sneak peek. Tell us what Sister Stardust is about.
Well, Sister Stardust is about, it's set in the late 60s in London, and it starts off with a young girl, a shop girl in the country who's desperate to get to London to live because London suddenly bursts into colour. The 50s, you know, Britain was recovering from the war and London had been decimated and there were bomb sites everywhere. There was no money. There was a tremendous depression. And all of a sudden in the 60s, England won the World Cup in football, or as Americans would say, soccer. Football. And we had the pill was introduced in 1963, and we had our own music for the first time. We had rock stars, which never happened before. We had the Beatles, we had the Rolling Stones. And so as London bursts into colour, Claire wants to go to London. She gets there and she gets swept up by a group of a rock band really, who kind of take her on and they whisk her off to Marrakesh to stay in the home of Paul and Talitha Getty. And Paul Getty Jr. was the son of the richest man in the world at the time. And his wife Talitha was a Dutch socialite and actress who was extraordinarily beautiful, very damaged. And they had bought this unbelievable riad, this old palace in Marrakesh that they'd renovated. They fell in love with it on their honeymoon, and they threw the doors open on New Year's Eve 1967, and Paul McCartney and John Lennon were so stoned that they didn't get off their backs off the floor the whole night. I mean, this is true, this has been documented. And she would throw these wild parties, and Claire, who renames herself Cece, is just spellbound by the Arabian Nights, and she doesn't realize that all of that hedonistic partying and the drugs and the sex and the craziness, the free love, and the insanity of these orgiastic nights are going to end in a tragedy, and going to bring a darkness to her life that she never anticipates. So that is Sister Stardust.
Well, first of all, I have to say, I just love this book so much. I mean, I love everything you write, but this is truly your best book yet. You know, it really is. It takes you to another place. And I felt like when I was reading it, I did feel completely transported. The language and the research that you've done, it really does sort of sweep you away in the most wonderful way. You very much feel like you're there. You almost feel like you can like smell the different scents from the marketplace. You really feel like you're there. So I guess my first question for you is, why Talitha Getty?
Oh. Yeah, I'm still trying to figure that out myself, actually. I first saw a photograph of her when I was a teenager. I can show you the photograph that I saw. It is, this is the photograph that I saw when I was a teenager. Mm. And you can see her incredible beauty and her husband standing behind her. And there was something so compelling for me about all of it. The exoticism of the rooftop in Marrakesh, and an expression that I couldn't read, but almost a sadness, I think, and her beauty, her tremendous beauty, and this exquisitely embroidered caftan, all of it I just found myself mesmerized. And because she did die young, and she died very tragically and under circumstances that the story changed. So nobody's quite sure what happened, other than that it happened when she was in her husband's apartment. He had become a heroin addict by that time. She died of a heroin overdose. But I think that, as so often happens in these very wealthy, powerful families, they lock down. And so there's very little written about her. And I think that was the thing. The mystery for me always was I wanted to find out more, because I couldn't find anything out. And so then, when my editor, when I joined HarperCollins and Hanover Square, the imprint, and my editor said, have you ever thought about writing historical fiction? And my first thought was, no. I immediately thought of World War II, because so many of our friends write World War II books, and they do it beautifully, but it just wasn't something I was interested in doing. But then I thought, well, I wonder if the 60s counts as historical fiction. And I told him the story, and he instantly said yes. And actually, it's one of the things I've really loved about him, John Glynn. He's also a writer, which I think has been enormously helpful, because one of the things I've had the last 10 years, I very much felt that because the publishing world has changed so much, and nobody knows what works anymore. So I've had editors try and direct me and put me into writing something that they think will work, or perhaps that is working for other authors, rather than saying, write the book that you're passionate about. And what he's always said to me is, write the book you're passionate about. And yeah, that was how I wrote Sister Stardust.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
So we're talking about Talitha Getty because obviously, she's a huge inspiration, but that's not the way into the story. And when I first started reading the book, that was something I thought was so interesting. Your first choice to bring us into the world through a different character, through Claire, later Cece. So how did you decide to bring us into this world through Claire, center the book on Claire first? And also, did that change? Was that your initial idea of how to do this book?
Well, that's a really great question. I think I knew I wanted to write about Talitha, but I think I was too frightened to write something from her point of view. I just didn't feel that I had the confidence, and I didn't know that I'd be able to find out enough about her to actually do that. I also loved the idea of having, you know, that sort of Gatsby-esque thing of having the narrator who's standing slightly on the outside and can have a much more circumspect view of what's happening. And so I think very early I realized that I needed to create a character who was standing on the outside. And I also borrowed from, I had loved Orphan Train by Christina Baker Klein, and I love the way she started in present day and went back into the past, and I had always wanted to use that device in a story, and this seemed like the perfect way to do it. So in fact, in the beginning, you know, you're meeting Claire as a woman in her 70s, who is sorting through her attic with her daughter, and her daughter is the one who sort of finds a box of treasures that hasn't been opened for years, and finally Claire is able to tell her the story of her youth.
Yeah, I love that part. I love that device as well, and I thought it worked so well in this book. It's funny, when I first started reading that chapter, I wasn't sure. At first I thought maybe that was Talitha, because I didn't know anything about her. I didn't know that she had died young. So it was like mysterious and interesting. And halfway through, I think I was like, oh wait, this is someone different. And then we get to know Claire, and I loved her so much. And I think that part of her that is longing for something different, and she's desperate to go to the city and reinvent herself, I related to that so deeply. And it actually, parts of it reminded me of Jemima J, because in a way it's a coming of age story for her, right? She is really changing. Well, I don't want to give too much away, but you know, she's living at home when we first meet her in the 60s, and you know, she goes through all of these changes. So it is sort of a coming of age story in a lot of ways, which I love. But okay, let's talk about the research. So you did a tremendous amount of research for this book. This book is clearly so heavily researched, so wonderfully researched. And I think a lot of readers, after they read it, will be sort of thirsty for more. So if you could pick one of the books or movies, you know, just one of the things that you read or watched about this time period, or about the Gettys in particular. I know it's tough because you have so much. And
yeah, it's really tough. I think probably the book that is the best to learn about it is I think it's All the Money in the World. I think it's John Pearson, and that book just has, because he interviewed so many people, so much of what I learned was from that. But then there's also, if you go on, so a lot of the people that have read it have gone down the rabbit hole of exploring and wanting to put faces to the characters. And so Bill Willis, who was their decorator, and is quite you know, he's a character that weaves in and out of the story, and is quite a large part. And I stumbled upon a documentary online that was actually made by some English people who bought Bill Willis's house in Marrakesh, and then proceeded to make this documentary about him. And one of the wonderful things in this documentary is they interview Christopher Gibbs, who's also in the book, who was an editor and a decorator and a dandy. He was really, and best friends with everybody in the 60s and 70s. He is now dead, but he tells wonderful stories, you know, and they were all, it's the other thing that's fascinating about the 60s. England has such a distinct class system, and you can never transcend the class into which you're born. So, you know, the upper classes only ever mix with the upper classes, and same for middle and lower. But all of a sudden in the 60s, a working class boy could become, and did become, David Bailey, you know, the most celebrated photographer in England. And the, you know, the Beatles were working class boys, and those Rolling Stones were middle class boys, and they were suddenly mixing with the aristocracy, and the aristocracy wanted to be best friends with them. And so, of course, in this interview, you know, they interview Christopher Gibbs, and you know, he was talking about Bill Willis and his jars of cocaine. And then, forgive me for this. This is not language I would use, but and then there's this Nicolette Mears was there. She was the estate manager for Le Palais de la Zahir, which was their palace. They all called it Sidi Mamoun, but this was the palace that Bill Willis restored, the Getty's palace. And Nicolette Mears was their estate manager, and she ran everything there. You know, she's awfully English. And at one point, you know, she's talking about Bill Willis, and she says, you know, and he'd just say, you know, something about like sucking off. He'd want to suck off, you know, he was obviously gay, and they say it's with, you know, it's just so funny because they're all in their sort of 70s and 80s, and you know, oh, you know, he was just a cocksucker, and I was just like, oh. But of course, but that's the extraordinary thing, actually, that this generation, in fact, I have to tell you another story, which is that back to Christina Baker-Klein, who is a friend of mine. She was supposed to be interviewed by another author who family circumstances got in the way. They asked me to step in last minute. And I ended up interviewing her at a live event. This was about 3 months ago in New York, and it was the Colony Club. And, you know, the Colony Club is one of the, you know, very patrician clubs in New York where, you know, all of the members are, they're all sort of in their 70s and 80s, and they've all got that sort of, that, well, no, it's like that Locust Valley, you know, Locust Valley lockjaw. And, you know, they're all terribly grand. And of course, we had this wonderful chat, Christina and I, on the stage. So there's a sea of sort of white-haired ladies in little boucle suits and sensible Ferragamo shoes. They were wonderful, and they were all wonderful. And at the end, Christina said, "Oh, Jane, tell them about Sister Stardust." And I started to tell them about Sister Stardust, and that, you know, the story was inspired by the Rolling Stones. And as I was talking, all these women who were like, they could have been my grandmothers almost, and they all got really excited, and I could see, and afterwards they were all coming, because of course they were all there, you know, they all lived through the 60s, and they all loved the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and they were coming up and telling me these amazing stories. And so I'm going back to talk to the lovely ladies of the Colony Club. But that's the thing, we don't realize when we see these older ladies that they lived a much wilder life than we could ever have even dreamed of.
Wow. Oh my goodness, that's fascinating to me. So, you know, speaking of all these crazy characters, so one of the things I loved about the book, there's a huge cast of characters. Some of them are real people, like you mentioned, the Rolling Stones, Paul McCartney, and then some of them are made up. So I have two questions. So first is, how did you decide which real people you would be including? And then how did you decide which people you would sort of be making up? And were any of the made up people actually based on real people?
So all of the real people who are still alive have sort of cameo roles. So it's more that they make an appearance. So, you know, Mick Jagger and Marianne Faithfull make an appearance, but it's completely anodyne. There's nothing. I just didn't dare write about anybody who was still alive. Also, by the way, this is why I was a rubbish journalist, because I am inherently a people pleaser, and I could never write anything horrible about anybody. I once got the most extraordinary interview with Hugh Grant, and it was the result of much too much wine and champagne, and he really opened up to me in a way that he would never have done had he been sober. And as I was listening to this interview, I just thought, well, I'm not going to use this, because, you know, he'll never talk to me again, like he's never going to talk to me again, like we're friends. But I just knew that it would he wouldn't have wanted this. I wouldn't have wanted this. And that's why I was always a rubbish journalist. So I think I was terrified of being sued by Mick Jagger. So all of the people that I wrote about in depth, I mean, happened to no longer be alive, but I was very aware that the descendants are alive and people who love them are still alive. And so I took great care. Look, I also will say, this was very much a love letter for me. It was a love letter to Marrakesh. It was a love letter to the 60s, which is a period of time that I have always been, felt very connected to. And it was a love letter to Talitha Getty. And I wanted to portray things realistically, but also take great care with it. And I feel that, we'll come to this in a bit, because I want to speak to the second part of your question. But I also think that Talitha was, and I hadn't realized this when I started researching how damaged she was, that she spent her early years in a Japanese internment camp. There was torture by the guards. She carried a trauma with her that today would have been dealt with somehow, would have, therapized or medicated, but those options weren't available. So we can talk about that later. Second part of your question is, was anybody based? Well, during the course of my research, I ended up discovering how linked the Rolling Stones were to Morocco during that time period, and that Morocco was a real retreat for them. I hadn't known, and of course Mick and Marianne were very friendly with the Gettys. In fact, he did leave the tapes of Wild Horses at Sidi Mamoun after he'd been to stay there. And during the research, I became really fascinated by the story of Brian Jones. And Brian, I remember, growing up, I'd always known that Brian Jones died young and Keith Moon died young, but I always got them mixed up. I could never remember which one was which, and just one, more of that tragic 27 Club. But actually what I discovered was that Brian Jones was this completely brilliant man and musically gifted. He was the man that founded the Rolling Stones. He found Mick and Keith, put the band together, named the band, and was the kind of musician where he played the sitar on all those Stones. I mean, he could pick up an instrument he'd never seen before and make beautiful sounds emerge from it within seconds. He was also unbelievably damaged, had been raised in a completely loveless household, and had been abused and went on to abuse the people around him, he had the most terrible drug problem. He was a drug addict, who also had this incredibly brilliant, beautiful girlfriend, Anita Pallenberg. And he would regularly beat her. Anita would slug him back, but she would, show up with black eyes. And then after, there was a big drugs bust, which is known as the Redlands bust, which happened in 1967, where a newspaper set up the Rolling Stones in this drugs bust. And to get away from all the press, Brian Jones, Anita Pallenberg, and Keith Richards took his car, which was a Bentley S3 Continental, down to Tangier. Brian caught pneumonia on the way down, so they dropped him off at a hospital. They were driving through France. They dropped him off at a hospital. Then, of course, Keith Richards and Anita Pallenberg proceeded to fall madly in love in the back of the Bentley, and which led to, children and a long relationship and great love between them. And Brian was another one who ended up dying very young and very tragically. And I hadn't known when I started writing it that this would fuel a huge part of the book. I mean, that story became the foundation for the story, for much of the story in Sister Stardust.
It's so amazing how, as you're doing this research, you know, sometimes you can start doing the research and think that you're just laying some groundwork or you
Yeah.
just have a little information, and then all of a sudden it like takes the book in different directions.
Was there something for you when you were researching the Liz Taylor ring that took it in a completely different direction?
Everything. I mean,
Yeah.
as I would be reading, it's, you know, that's why I was nodding as you were speaking. I felt like I would hear a story or I'd watch a documentary or read a book, and then I would just sort of like follow that trail. And then you get inspired for something else and you're like, no, 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 I'm just going to shift all of this. And all of a sudden you're changing huge parts of the
Yeah.
book. But I don't know, that organic way of writing the book, I think can be a really good thing. I know there are writers out there who outline and they follow an outline when they write. And, you know, it sounds to me like you wrote Sister Stardust in a very similar way that I wrote the Liz Taylor ring. It's like, I sort of knew, but not really. And the research just sort of like took me to different places. So it was at a point like literally every day I would watch a Liz Taylor movie or I'd read something and I would just keep changing the book, and it just kept morphing because you know, you get all these juicy details. Like you just told all these stories, like each one I'm like Googling that.
Yeah.
And I remember as I was reading the book, that's why I asked about the fictional versus the made up characters. I think I was texting you and I'm like, wait, is this a made up character? Because I was Googling everyone, and you know, you just want to know more, right?
Yes, I almost wish, I mean, it occurs to me now, of course, that I almost wish I had put in, you know, a page of who was real and who wasn't, just so people could. Maybe I'll do that on my website that I never update and have actually forgotten about because I'm so completely overwhelmed with everything I have to do.
In all your spare time, just
and breathe.
Okay, so I mentioned before, I felt like I've related really deeply to Claire, although I want to be a Talitha. Like I want to relate to her, but I'm really more of a Claire. Which character in the book did you sort of relate to the most?
I think this is why you and I sort of recognized each other, because I am inherently a pleaser and a good girl and a rule follower. I am that person who stands patiently in line, and God forbid somebody cuts and I will go, because it's the injustice. No, we're all standing waiting, get to the back of the line.
Thank you.
But I want to be a rule breaker. I wish I was a rule breaker. I wish I was a free spirit. I'm definitely turning 50 was pretty seismic for me, and I think I've become much freer and I'm having much more fun. But like you, I am much more of a Claire who wanted to be, who wanted a Talitha to sort of help her just unfold.
Yeah, you know, there's also something to that, like a woman like Talitha, it feels like she really just goes with the flow and life takes her and she's okay with that. And at one point Claire is sort of doing that, but that's not really Claire's nature. There's just something to that, just like you want to go here, okay, get in a car and go here, sure. And I would like to be more like that in my regular life, I think.
And she really, I mean, by all accounts, she really was extraordinary. She was a free spirit. She was incredibly beautiful and sensual, and she loved people, and she brought the party wherever she went, and she was always laughing. And I now believe that she spent her life running from pain, actually, and I think towards the end she suffered from tremendous depression, and she was able to dress up and go to the parties and pretend that everything in her life was as it always was. She was always insecure. She always worried that people only wanted to be friends with her because she was married to Paul Getty Jr. She didn't think that people were interested in her. And towards the end, she was having thyroid issues, and I don't know whether depression was part of that, but she was not, I don't know, in some ways she was one of those kind of magical spirits that almost you can't imagine old. You know, there's almost an inevitability to the tragedy that occurred.
Oh, wow. Yeah, absolutely. So I want to talk a little about your artwork. and how Talitha not only inspired you to write a book, but get back to your own drawing and painting. Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, I went to art school 100 years ago and haven't done anything in, well, I mean, I've done lots of things. Like I was painting the shells, and I mean, they were decoupage, but my own design, you know, I was designing and then printing them out on tissue paper. And I get these crazy, I mean, there's always something creative that I've got going on. That's a huge part of my life, whether it's decorating a house or painting shells or making jewelry, or there's always something. And I'm very obsessive, so I get terribly obsessive about these things. And I just started to sketch the characters while I was writing, while I was researching actually, and then during the writing. And actually what was lovely as well was, because I hadn't drawn anything for such a long time, just seeing the progression from the early sketches which were a bit wonky, and then the more I did, I could sort of feel the skill coming back, like just the kind of, I mean, and I still, if I walk into an art studio, I am just the smell of terps and you know, old paint spattered easels and you know, those sort of drop cloths on the floor, and nothing makes me feel quite so at home. I just, that and riding stables as well, actually, horse boxes, just the smell, because I was also a horsey kid who was always, you know, never happier than mucking. I know. So here's the thing, Brenda, I think that's been the thing about turning 50. I'm now very comfortable in who I am. The real me, that is the real me is actually an artist. I probably am a bit bohemian. I'm definitely not a pack creature. I don't fit in with the rest, and I don't want to, but for 50 years I tried really hard to. And I also sort of, because I felt so inadequate and so insecure, I tried very hard to step into a persona and to be so, and I think I came across as being quite great, also because I'm English in America. You know, I think people thought that I was sort of elegant and quite grand, and I'm actually not at all. And now I feel like the two parts of me are completely in sync, whereas they weren't before. The people that knew me knew exactly who I was, because I haven't changed as a person. But I think to look at me, you would have thought that I was a very different kind of person, whereas now I think my outsides match my insides, which they didn't necessarily then. What were we talking about? I've just gone off on some crazy tangent.
It was good. Okay, so I'll bring it back to the book. So
thank you.
Let's talk about, so now you have a novel coming out during the tail end of the pandemic. I don't even know, are we still in the pandemic? I feel like we are, but everywhere I go on Long Island, no one's wearing a mask, so maybe we're not. But
yeah,
you have a novel coming out. Let's call it the tail end of the pandemic, which means you wrote a novel during the pandemic. So we need to talk about that, because writing during the pandemic is sort of unlike other types of writing, in my opinion. So tell me what that was like.
Well, actually, for me, it was kind of joyous. First of all, I mean, a pandemic for an introverted writer is like heaven on earth. So, you know, I was actually it was very hard for me in the beginning because I had all the kids home. We have 6 kids. Everybody was home. Even in the old house, it wasn't big enough for 6 kids all home and us. And you know, because they're big, they're in their 20s, you know, a couple of teenagers, but the rest are in their 20s. Everybody was home. That was really hard because there was no quiet, and so that was rough. Then I went to London to research and write Sister Stardust, and that was glorious. I started off in Hastings, staying at my gorgeous friend Sam Taylor's historic home, rock house, like on a rock at the top of the hill overlooking the sea, and this old, just wonderful old seaside town. And I had one child with me, my son, who was doing remote school, so he'd be in the little study doing homework all day, and I didn't have any other children to cook for. I had no husband around. He was here for the first few weeks, and all I had to do was write, and it was glorious. Then I moved to London, and we got a wonderful flat. And, you know, my goal was, of course, I had all these lunches planned and interviewing people and meeting everybody, and London was locked down. And so I didn't meet anybody. There were no restaurants, there were no cafes, there were nothing. There were walks, there was walking every day. And I would meet friends and walk. And actually one woman who might still become part of the research of a recent book. I'd read her book as part of my research for Sister Stardust. Her name is Jenny Boyd. Years ago, Donovan wrote the song Jennifer Juniper for her. Her sister is Patty Boyd, who was married to George Harrison and then Eric Clapton. And I had read Jenny Boyd's book, Jennifer Juniper, as part of the research. And then we met in London walking, and actually she became my walking buddy. So we'd go and walk in Primrose Hill and Regent's Park. And she was part of the kind of entourage that traveled to Rishikesh in the late 60s with the Beatles to visit the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi at the ashram. And I still have an idea that that's a story I would like to take on at some point, perhaps, but we shall see.
Oh, I love it. So, well, now that you've written a novel of historical fiction, do you think you're going to stick with that, or just wherever the next story takes you?
I have a contemporary book that I've written that I really, really love, that I would like to, that to come out. I have just finished but not edited the sequel to Sister Stardust, but not as a novel, it's a novella. So it's and in fact it's not, well, it may be published, but it will initially be released. It's going to be serialized on a podcast with Gemini 13, and that will be coming out in the fall. So that will be a highly produced podcast. So that's taking a couple of characters from Sister Stardust and taking them forward to 1979.
Wow. Now, will you be narrating this podcast?
No, it will be, it's almost like, it's almost going to be like one of those old fashioned radio plays. I mean, acted and sound effects.
Oh, you're kidding.
Yeah.
Whoa, that's a really exciting project.
It is really exciting. And actually that was another one, because that was also, because it was drawn from real people. I really do love that. I love the rigor of the research and the way that, as you said, you don't even have to know the story. You have to fall in love with your characters. And when you fall in love with your characters, the more you learn about them, the more it inspires you with the story.
Absolutely. I always say that you have to write about something you're obsessed with, because you spend so long writing the book. It could take a year or two just to write the book. Then editing could take a year or two, and then promotion, if you're lucky, is at least a year or two, right?
Yeah.
So you're with this material for such a long period of time, so you do have to sort of choose wisely.
Yeah.
And only choose World War II if you're obsessed with World War II, because you will be talking about it for years.
Well, yeah, and you know what? I've always said, when people ask me for advice, one of my pieces of advice is always, don't write what you think will be a bestseller. Write the story you need to tell. And yet I haven't followed my own advice for years now, because I've been pushed to do things that publishers or agents have thought would work. And I realize that's been really problematic for me. And certainly there have been a couple of books that I've written in the last few years that I have adored. I adored The Sunshine Sisters. I adored Tempting Fate. But some of those other books I really haven't adored. And I've done it because I was sort of told to do this. And it was so freeing to discover how much I love writing again.
I'm always asked, for advice from people. And on this tour, what I've been telling people is they say, oh, what do you say to people who want to be a writer? And I say, if you can do anything else, do that, please, just do that. You only become a writer if like you really just can't, like you can't stop writing, because you know, the industry is so hard. I actually had a reader write to me after one of my book talks, and she was like, why is it so hard? What were you talking about? And, you know, I think every industry has gotten particularly hard in the last 2 years, but this was happening before the pandemic, things sort of changing. They've just changed really quickly, I think, over the last.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. It's that it's just accelerated everything. I mean, I tell people now a lot, which my feelings about this have changed enormously. I say, look, if you want to do it, but please look at different ways of doing it. You know, I think that you know, it used to be that traditional publishing was the only way because it gave you sort of credibility, and I don't know that that's true anymore. I think there are other really fascinating ways of doing things, like the podcast. You know, it does. Audible Originals are doing amazing things. There are so many other avenues that you can explore that are open to you. And, you know, I know people who have had enormous success with independent publishing. And they always say the problem with independent publishing is that, you know, you have to become a marketing genius. I'm like, oh, God, you know, doing an awful lot now.
You know, I don't know. I think traditional publishing, though, you know, as a woman, and, you know, women in publishing, it is harder. And you do sort of need, like you said, that gravitas. And you need, it's just like when I was a lawyer, you know, I was a very unhappy lawyer, but I remember one of the last jobs I interviewed for, I think the partner, she like knew I was on my way out. And I had already, I think I might at that point have already taken my first writing class, but, you know, I was an unhappy lawyer, and I guess people knew it. But she said something to the effect of, but, you know, no one could ever take that away from you. And as a woman, you need certain things that men don't need to be taken seriously. And I do think there's something to that. So like back in the day for me, it was being a lawyer. And still now people are always like, well, you're a lawyer. And I am, that is true. But I think the traditional publisher route can give you sort of that, I don't know, leg up and be taken more seriously.
I think that's very true with literary fiction. I don't know about commercial fiction, actually. I don't know. And yeah, I mean, I'm definitely aware with this book of having a kind of attention that I haven't had before. You know, it's an Indie Next pick, it's a Library Reads pick, and this is my first time in a 27-year career that's ever happened to me. And I wonder whether, I do think perhaps historical fiction has a different perception.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, to be continued on that question.
Yeah.
We will talk about that more, but we've got something in the Q&A. So the question is, for both amazing authors, do you lead your characters or do they lead you? Is it different at different points during the writing and editing process? So, I mean, I think we covered a little of that because we were talking about our research. So do you want to start with that? But this is more centered on the characters.
Well, I would say even if when it's not historical fiction, you think that your characters, you think that you may, I mean, I probably like you, I sort of map it out. I sort of follow the traditional Greek 3-act structure. So I sort of know the beginning and I have a vague idea of what the middle is, and then I know the ending. I think what changes, I've learned to be quite loose about it, because the truth is that when you've drawn your characters correctly, they will tell you what's going to happen, and you can't really fight it. It just feels wrong at a certain point. That's been my experience. Brenda, what about you?
I couldn't agree more. Co-sign on all of that. I think that, right, I'm the same way in that I do beginning, middle, and end. and I get like a little more detailed because I think, did I tell you this? I took a screenwriting class, and so I actually—
Was it McKee? You didn't do McKee's story, did you?
No, I've read that, but no, this was a screenwriting class that was really for novelists, like teaching screenwriting tricks so you could sort of put it in your novel. So just the idea of like writing towards a midpoint to eliminate that saggy middle, you know, things
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
So for Liz, I wrote it with like an eight sequence structure. So, I mean, it was very structured, but when I first started writing, obviously I didn't know what the structure was. I barely knew beginning, middle, and end. So for me, the characters really led me. Like there's a part where people say my main character, one of my main characters, her name is Addie, and people talk about, there's like this big reveal in the end about Addie, and people are like, that's what made her so great. And you know, they think that that was sort of like baked in because that's like who Addie is and it's the best part of her. And no, Addie told me that about her as I was writing the ending, and I sort of surprised myself. And when I wrote it, I remember a lot of writing through the pandemic for me was just sort of like, this is crazy and no good, but you got to get your 1,000 words in, so just write it anyway.
Yeah.
So I wrote that big secret that she had, sort of thinking I was going to erase it. But then the next day I was like, no, I think this is good. So Addie sort of took me there. So
Yeah.
I like the way you're saying, like, if your characters, if you've developed them enough, they are going to sort of lead you.
Yeah.
But you need to really do all of that writing and rewriting and really thinking about them.
Yeah.
I always say, like, it's walking around with your characters. Do you ever do this trick where, like, you know, you'll go to like the supermarket or the bank or the drugstore, wherever you go in your day to day, and you sort of carry them with you? So like you mentioned that thing, you know, someone's in line and someone's cutting, and Jane is like, what are you doing? How could you do this? But
Yeah.
how would your character? So like, I'll think like, oh, but what would Addie do in this situation? What would Nathan do? And what would Courtney do? Three
Oh,
different reactions. So I like walk around with them.
okay, that's really weird. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
It
It's
is.
not weird. It's probably quite clever. I do something else. I do something else that's also probably weird, which is, and it's one of the things that I really love about the pandemic. I love a mask because I mutter to myself. I kind of walk around and I'll go on walks and I'll sort of talk about them, and I have to somehow say it out loud. And sometimes it's sort of dialogue, or sometimes it's just asking myself the question, and I don't know if Talitha, what would, and I find walking really, really good, really, really good to when I'm really confused or struggling with a story. A walk is brilliant. Planes, cars. I mean, any form of transportation really is good for me. Trains, planes, and cars. And also that moment when, you know, like with Addie's secret, I find it exhilarating when suddenly it comes together. You know, you haven't really been able to figure this out, but suddenly it just all comes together in this way that makes perfect sense, and you know it's absolutely right.
Absolutely. Yeah, there is something great about that feeling.
Yeah.
So I always wonder, the people who plot their novels so carefully, I guess they leave room for that, right? When a surprise happens, then they have to readjust everything.
It's funny. I mean, the contemporary book that I have written that has not yet been shown to anyone, I plotted that very, very carefully.
Because that was after McKee. Was that?
Yeah, it was after McKee, and I had an agent at the time who was also a screenwriter, and he's kind of wanted me to do this very, very detailed outline because that's how he worked. I really loved the book, and in some ways it was kind of easier. It felt a bit like writing by numbers because once I'd sort of plotted the whole thing out, and actually that's how I wrote Jemima J, because I was stranded in LA. I'd gone to LA to research it, and my computer, I mean, this was in 1998. I mean, I had like some crappy computer that I bought from Nobody Beats the Whiz, and Nobody Beats the Whiz because it broke after a day, and then it was like that was in the day when things broke, they'd be in the shop for a month. So I had a month in LA with no computer, so I couldn't write because I do type. And so I used to go and sit in the 3rd Street Deli in Santa Monica with a notepad, and I just dreamed up Jemima J, and I wrote the outline of that entire book in a notepad sitting in the 3rd Street Deli.
Wow, that's so interesting. I think that readers find it really interesting that not every book is the same.
Yeah.
My process is different because I think, you know, your life changes. So of course, the way you're doing your creative outlet is going to change, right?
Yeah.
Like the process changes. And then certainly if you're writing something different than what you've written before, of course that process will be different.
And your voice changes, which is actually why, you know, I've never written a sequel to Jemima J, even though I am asked to do that all the time. My voice today is not the same voice as Jemima, and I think people want just a continuation.
They do.
And I wouldn't know how to do that.
Wow, that's so interesting. Yeah, that makes so much sense. Wow. I'm just like thinking about it now. I feel like you probably could dive back into that character, but all right, we're going to talk about that offline a little.
Yes.
I have more to say about Jemima J.
I think we've come to the end of another gorgeous conversation. Thank you. Oh no.
I don't think.
Dana, we can't hear you. Dana, we can't hear you, Dana.
You think I would have this down by now? 2 years later, guys. Fabulous night. Jane, one more question for you. For our readers, when they pick up this beautiful book, what is your greatest wish for them once they finish it? What do you hope they take from it?
Actually, I think I just hope that it transports them to another time and another place, and that they are able to lose themselves completely and just feel like they've had a fabulous trip in every sense of the word.
I'm certain that they will. Thank you. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Brenda. Thank you for sharing your time with us. It was such an honor to have you both on again. Please come back. And big congratulations to you both. Much success, everyone. Sister Stardust by Jane Green. You can pre-order now, and signed book plates are available while supplies last. Also, the Liz Taylor ring is out now and available for purchase. On behalf of RJ Julia, Wesley and RJ Julia in Brookhampton, we thank you for being with us tonight. And as always, supporting these fabulous authors and your local independent bookstores. So have a wonderful night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.